It was supposed to be a simple hike, just a few miles on a trail I'd never been on before. I had read up about it and seen the beautiful photos online. Clear skies, a few scattered clouds, tall pines, and a winding creek. It seemed perfect for what I needed. A break. I wasn't expecting anything extraordinary, but sometimes the quiet of nature is enough, or so I thought. I had started early, around 7 a.m., to avoid the crowd. It was late summer. The air still had the warmth of the season, but the mornings were crisp with a coolness that reminded me of autumn just around the corner. The trailhead was in a small, secluded part of the forest, far from the busy trail systems of the national park. That's why I chose it. I didn't want to deal with crowds of people or the noise of civilization. The first part of the trail was easy. The path was well worn, just wide enough for me to walk comfortably. There were no real obstacles, just some roots and rocks here and there, but they weren't a problem. The trees shaded the path, keeping the sun from hitting me too hard, and the soft rustling of leaves was the only sound I could hear besides my breathing and the crunch of my boots on the dirt. I could feel the peace settling in as I walked, my muscles loosening, and my thoughts quieting. I didn't even bring much with me, just a backpack with some water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a map. I had a compass too, though I wasn't expecting to need it. The trail was straightforward, and the signs at the trailhead were clear. I had no intention of getting lost, but I'd always thought that people who get lost do so because they make small mistakes early on, and then, bit by bit, they stray further off track until it's too late. As I moved deeper into the forest, the path began to narrow. The trees grew thicker, and the light filtering through the canopy was softer, almost like it was becoming more intimate. The temperature dropped slightly, and I started to appreciate the quiet even more. The air had a damp, earthy smell now, like the forest was waking up after the night. At around 9 a.m., I reached a part of the trail where the trees opened up, and I found a small stream. The water was clear, sparkling in the sunlight, and I could hear the sound of it tumbling over rocks. It was peaceful. I stopped here for a while, taking a drink from my water bottle and just sitting on a rock by the bank, watching the water flow by. For a moment, I let my mind wander, thinking about how lucky I was to be out here, alone, with nothing but the sound of the stream and the wind in the trees. I looked at my map then, just to check my progress. I had marked where I wanted to turn around. There was a scenic overlook about 3 miles in that I wanted to see, and I had planned to stop there for a snack before heading back. But the more I looked at the map, the more I realized the trail seemed to continue past the overlook, winding into parts of the forest I hadn't read about. I wasn't entirely sure where it went, but it didn't look too far. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to continue. The path grew more rugged, the ground uneven, and the trees began to close in again. The sunlight barely touched the forest floor here, and the air felt colder, heavier. As I pressed on, the sound of the stream began to fade, replaced by the occasional snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. I told myself it was just the wind or some small animal moving through the underbrush. It was likely nothing more than that. About an hour passed, and I started to feel the isolation. The trail had become less distinct, harder to follow. I had to pay more attention to where I was stepping, and the further I went, the less I could hear the usual forest noises. It was like the forest had gone still, too still. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, but I shrugged it off as just nerves. There was nothing to worry about. Then, I saw something that caught my attention. There was a patch of ground up ahead, near a cluster of rocks, that looked disturbed. The soil was freshly turned, and there were marks on the ground, deep, uneven scrapes. I took a few steps closer to get a better look. It didn't look like animal tracks. No, these were much larger and more irregular, like something heavy had dragged its feet across the ground. My heart rate picked up. I had no idea what it was, but it didn't feel right. I kept moving, but now I was walking more cautiously. The trail was barely there now, a few patches of overgrown grass and moss marking where I should step. It was hard to shake the feeling that I was being watched. My skin crawled as I continued, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every so often. But there was nothing, just trees, rocks, and dirt. Yet the feeling wouldn't go away. The trail wound up a small hill, and as I reached the top, I was struck by how quiet it had become. I looked around, but all I could see were the towering trees and the forest stretching on in every direction. There was no sign of the overlook, no indication that I was anywhere near it. I checked my map again, but I couldn't find my exact location. The trail seemed to be disappearing into the wilderness, taking me further and further away from any familiar landmarks. At that point, the feeling of being watched intensified. Couldn't shake it. My instincts were screaming at me that something was wrong. I needed to turn back. I started retracing my steps, but the trail was so faint now that I had trouble finding where it had been. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that I just needed to focus, but my heart was pounding in my chest. The trees closed in around me, blocking out the sunlight, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. It was hard to breathe. And then I heard something. It was faint at first, a rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. I froze, straining to hear. It was hard to tell where it was coming from, but it sounded close, too close. I glanced around, my eyes scanning the shadows between the trees, but I saw nothing. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. Quickened my pace, my heart racing. Every step I took felt heavier, like the earth itself was resisting me. The feeling of being watched grew more intense, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I had to get out of there. I didn't care about the overlook anymore. I just wanted to get back to the trailhead. But no matter how much I walked, the trees seemed to close in more. I was getting turned around. My sense of direction was failing me. I tried to stay calm, but the panic started to set in. What if I was lost? What if I couldn't find my way back? That's when I realized something terrifying. The rustling was getting louder. It was behind me now, not just a single sound, but multiple all around me, growing in intensity. I whipped around, my breath caught in my throat, but there was nothing, just trees, rocks, and shadows. But I wasn't alone. I knew it. I started running. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and I stumbled over rocks and roots, barely catching myself before falling. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there. I couldn't stay where I was being watched, where I couldn't see what was following me. The sounds of movement in the underbrush were growing louder and closer, and my chest burned with the effort of running. I wasn't sure if it was something chasing me or if it was just my mind playing tricks, but I wasn't willing to take any chances. I had no choice but to trust my instincts. After what felt like forever, I stumbled upon a clearing. The sun broke through the trees, and for the first time in what seemed like ages, I could breathe again. I was out of the dense forest, standing in a small, open area. My heart was still racing, but the fear had started to subside. I looked around, realizing that the sounds of movement had stopped. I was still lost, but at least I wasn't being chased anymore. I took out my map again, trying to find my bearings. The clearing wasn't marked, but it seemed like it was in the direction of the trailhead. I decided to follow it, even though the fear still gripped me. It wasn't until an hour later that I finally saw a familiar landmark, a large rock I had passed earlier on the trail. Relief washed over me. I had made it back. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. I was exhausted, my mind still racing with what had happened. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing. I wasn't coming back to that trail. Not ever. I had made it out, and that was all that mattered. I've been planning this hike for months. The idea was simple. A solo trip into the mountains, away from everything. No cell service, no distractions, just me, the trail, and nature. I needed to clear my head, maybe get some perspective on things in my life that felt off. So, I picked a relatively quiet part of the forest, known for its isolation. It wasn't far from civilization, but just enough to give the feeling of being cut off. I got to the trailhead early in the morning, the sun still low in the sky, just starting to spill light over the horizon. The weather was perfect, cool, with a light breeze. I'd packed light, just the essentials. A water bottle, snacks, a map, a first aid kit, and my trusty pocket knife. The trail started off easy, winding gently through thick trees and brush. The quiet was almost oppressive, with nothing but the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind or the distant call of a bird. It was peaceful, but there was a tension in the air, like something was about to happen. I didn't think much of it at first. Hiking in the woods alone was something I'd done before, and I was used to the solitude. As I walked deeper into the forest, the path narrowed, and the trees grew taller and denser, casting deep shadows on the ground. The air felt cooler here, and I could smell the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. I was getting into the groove of it, focusing on the rhythm of my steps and the sound of my breath. About 3 hours in, I came across something that caught my attention: a set of footprints in the dirt. They didn't look like animal tracks. They were too human. Not big enough to be from an adult, but definitely a person. Maybe a teenager? I bent down to get a closer look. The prints were clear, muddy, deep impressions like someone had been walking here just recently. They seemed fresh, not more than a day old. My first instinct was to assume they were from a hiker who'd passed through earlier. But something about them made me uneasy. The footprints didn't follow the path like they were supposed to. They wandered off to the side, leading into thicker underbrush where no trail existed. I felt a slight shiver run down my spine but shook it off. The forest was big. People get lost. Maybe it was just someone going off track to explore. Still, I couldn't help but feel a little more aware of my surroundings after that. The silence of the forest was growing heavier, the stillness almost suffocating. I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard any animals. No birds singing, no squirrels rustling through the leaves. I started to push on, but that nagging feeling in the back of my mind wouldn't let up. The trail began to get steeper, and I focused on climbing the narrow switchbacks. The trees thinned a little here, but there was something off about the way the light was filtering through the branches. It was like everything was just quieter. My footsteps seemed louder too, almost like they were echoing in the still air. Around noon, I stopped to take a break by a small stream. The water gurgled softly over the rocks, and I sat on a nearby boulder to drink some water and eat a granola bar. It was peaceful here, just the sound of the stream and the rustling of the trees. I felt my muscles relax for the first time all day. But then I heard it. A twig snapped somewhere in the distance. The noise was sharp, like it was intentionally loud, and my head snapped up, eyes scanning the forest around me. There was no one. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, but it didn't feel like that. It didn't feel natural. I finished my break quickly and got back on the trail. The path was getting narrower, and the forest was growing thicker, like the trees were closing in around me. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. It was starting to feel like I was the only person left on Earth. No other hikers, no sound but the occasional rustle of the trees. Another hour passed. The footprints I'd seen earlier were long forgotten, but the unease had settled in deep, gnawing at my insides. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone behind me. Every so often, I'd hear the faintest sound, a distant shuffle, like footsteps. But when I turned, there was nothing. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. A red bandana caught on a branch. It looked like it had been placed there, not just blown onto the branch by the wind. I stopped in my tracks and stared at it, my heart starting to race. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew enough to be scared. It wasn't something someone would just leave behind. Not on a trail like this, where it was unlikely to be found by anyone but another hiker. I thought about turning around, going back, but the thought of retracing my steps through the forest, the same empty woods I had just come from, felt even worse. I didn't know what to do. I kept walking. My footsteps felt heavier, slower, like the weight of something unknown was pressing down on me. The sky was starting to darken, the sun hidden behind thick clouds that had rolled in without warning. I hadn't noticed how the weather had shifted until it was too late. Now, the wind had picked up, sending branches creaking and swaying above me. A chill ran through me as I realized I'd lost track of time. The sun was setting fast, and I wasn't anywhere near the top of the mountain. In fact, I wasn't sure where I was anymore. I checked my map, but it was no help. The trail I was on didn't seem to match any of the ones marked. I was off course, and I had no idea how to get back. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I could make it back. I just had to stay calm. But when I looked up, the feeling that I wasn't alone hit me again. I could hear the rustling of leaves, the sound of movement in the trees. It was like something was following me, moving with me. But when I turned, there was nothing. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My senses were on high alert now, my eyes darting from tree to tree. Every noise, every shadow, every movement sent my heart racing. I wasn't alone out here. I knew it now. Someone was watching me. I kept walking, faster this time, my feet stumbling on the uneven ground as I tried to push myself harder. I needed to find a way out. I didn't care if I was off the trail. I just needed to get out of the woods. Then I heard it again, the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone there, but there was nothing but the trees. My breath was coming faster now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it in my bones. I kept walking. I had to, but my mind kept racing, running through every possible scenario. What if someone was out there? Someone who didn't want me to leave? What if those footprints weren't just some lost hiker, but someone who was deliberately tracking me? Just as panic started to rise in my chest, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. A small shelter hidden behind thick trees. It was barely visible, a simple structure built from logs and stone. It wasn't on the map. I approached it cautiously, trying not to make a sound, my instincts screaming at me to turn around and leave. But I couldn't. I had to know what was inside. I pushed the door open, creaking on its hinges. Inside, it was sparse. A couple of old blankets, a small fire pit in the center, and an abandoned backpack in the corner. The backpack was covered in dirt, and the straps were frayed, like it had been sitting there for years. But it hadn't been there long enough to be this weathered. I backed away, my heart racing. This place, something about it didn't feel right. I turned to leave, but as I stepped out, I froze. The figure was standing just outside the door. I didn't scream. I didn't even have time to think. The figure just stood there, watching me. The hair on my neck prickled, and for the first time all day, I didn't feel fear. I felt relief, not because I wasn't alone, but because I knew I wasn't crazy. I wasn't alone. The weekend felt like a perfect opportunity to get away from the noise of everyday life. The kids were finally off to their grandmother's house for the weekend, and my wife and I had decided it was time to escape to the cabin we had inherited from my uncle. He'd passed a few years ago, and while the cabin sat quietly in the woods, it wasn't exactly the most well-kept. Still, I figured it'd be the ideal place to disconnect and reset for a few days. The cabin was about 3 hours away, nestled in the woods in a remote area. It was simple, no running water, no electricity, but that's part of the charm, right? My uncle had always enjoyed the isolation, and I shared a bit of that sentiment. We had visited a few times when I was younger, but I hadn't been there in years. The place had its charm, but there was always a slight unease in the back of my mind whenever I spent time there. An odd feeling that didn't sit well, like I wasn't entirely welcome. Still, I brushed those thoughts off as we packed up the car, grabbed some food, and set off. It was a sunny Friday afternoon when we left, and the drive was peaceful at first. The roads twisted through dense forests and small towns. The air grew thicker as we ventured deeper into the woods, and I started to feel a certain quiet that only this kind of isolation could bring. No cars on the road, no signs of life except the occasional squirrel darting across the asphalt. Felt good, almost peaceful. When we finally arrived at the cabin, it stood there as I remembered it, weathered but still standing firm against the elements. The paint had peeled off years ago, the wooden steps creaked under our weight, and the surrounding trees were tall and dense. The sound of birds and wind rustling through the leaves was the only thing we could hear. It looked like no one had been there for months, maybe longer. I could feel the air cool as evening approached, and I started to think about how isolated we really were. Inside, the cabin was basic. There was a fireplace, a few mismatched chairs, a table, and a small kitchen area with an old propane stove. The bed in the corner was covered in a dusty quilt. We opened the windows to let the air in, took our bags inside, and started unloading our things. The first night passed quietly. We made a simple dinner, set up the camp lantern for some light, and settled into the cabin's old, creaky furniture. I wasn't bothered by the silence at first, but as the night wore on, I felt a sense of being watched. It wasn't anything overt, just a faint feeling, like the cabin itself was aware of our presence. My wife noticed it too, though we didn't speak much about it. It wasn't uncomfortable, but there was a weight to the stillness, something subtle yet persistent in the back of my mind. I woke up in the middle of the night. I don't know what woke me. Maybe a sound, maybe just an instinct, but something felt wrong. I lay still in the bed, listening. I didn't hear anything immediately, but then I heard it. A faint scratching sound. It was coming from outside, maybe by the back door. I tried to brush it off as an animal, raccoons or something similar, but it sounded different, more deliberate, as if something was trying to make its way in. I lay there, tension creeping in. Every creak of the cabin seemed louder now, and the wind rustled through the trees with an eerie, almost unsettling tone. My wife was still asleep, breathing deeply. I debated getting up to check, but quickly dismissed the thought. It would probably be nothing. Still, the scratching continued intermittently, growing louder and more frequent. I finally couldn't ignore it. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly crept out of bed. The old wooden floorboards creaked under my weight, and the sound echoed throughout the cabin. I tried to move as quietly as possible, making my way to the back door. My heart was pounding, and a strange sense of dread filled the air. It was strange. I had been to this cabin so many times, and I had never felt this way before. But tonight, everything seemed off. I reached the back door and peered through the window next to it. Nothing. I shone the flashlight across the yard and surrounding trees, but the beam didn't reveal anything unusual, just the dark, looming trees swaying in the breeze. I stood there for a moment, wondering if I had imagined it. But then, the scratching sound came again, this time louder, more distinct. It was right near the door. I opened the door slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The cold air hit me immediately, and I pulled my jacket tighter. I stepped out onto the porch and shone the flashlight around. There was nothing in the immediate vicinity, but I could see something strange near the edge of the forest. A dark shape, too large to be an animal, too small to be a person, seemed to shift among the trees. I froze. My mind raced, but I stood there, staring at the shape for what felt like an eternity. It moved again, and my heart leapt into my throat. I had to make a decision. I could run back inside and lock the door, but I didn't know what I was dealing with. The scratching continued, now coming from several places around the cabin. I turned and hurried back inside, closing the door behind me as quickly and quietly as possible. My hands were shaking as I locked the door. I felt an overwhelming sense of panic, but tried to remain calm. My wife stirred in the bed, but I didn't wake her. I stayed up for the rest of the night, sitting by the fire, listening for any more sounds. The scratching didn't stop, but it was quieter now, more distant. I didn't dare go outside again. The next morning, I inspected the cabin. I checked all the windows, the doors, and the areas around the porch. I found nothing that could explain the strange sounds. No claw marks, no footprints, nothing out of the ordinary. It made no sense, but the unease didn't go away. That day, I decided to go out for a hike in an effort to clear my mind. I needed to distract myself from the strange events of the night before. The sun was up, and the air was cool but not unpleasant. I grabbed a few supplies, including a pocket knife and a water bottle, and headed down the old trail that ran behind the cabin. The path was overgrown in parts, and I had to push through thick brush at times, but it was familiar to me. I remembered hiking here with my uncle as a kid. We used to spend hours on these trails, exploring the woods, collecting rocks and sticks, and just enjoying the solitude. But today, the woods felt different, darker, quieter. I walked for about an hour, heading further away from the cabin. The trail was narrow, and I had to watch my step. I didn't see any wildlife, no squirrels, no birds, nothing. The silence was oppressive. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was being drawn into the woods, away from the safety of the cabin. Eventually, I came to a clearing. There was a small creek running through it, the water babbling softly. I stopped for a moment to rest, sitting on a large rock by the edge of the creek. The tension in my chest began to ease. I closed my eyes and listened to the sound of the water, trying to calm myself. Then I heard something again. The same scratching noise, distant but unmistakable. It was coming from somewhere behind me, further into the woods. I stood up quickly, heart racing. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I wasn't alone. Something was out there, couldn't stay there. I turned and headed back to the cabin, moving as quickly as I could through the woods. The path seemed longer, more difficult to navigate on the way back. My thoughts were racing, and my senses were on high alert. The scratching sound had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. When I reached the cabin, I bolted the door behind me and checked every window once more. There was no sign of anyone or anything outside. Still, I couldn't relax. The unease was still there, a gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. I spent the rest of the day inside, not daring to venture out again. The following morning, we packed up our things and left, leaving the cabin behind. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. The cabin stood quietly among the trees, but for the first time, I felt relieved to be leaving it behind. I don't know what was out there in the woods. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe it was something else. But I never returned to that cabin again. It's still there, sitting quietly in the woods, waiting. And I'll never forget the way it made me feel, as if I were being watched by something that wasn't human. Something that was waiting for the right moment to make its move. It was supposed to be a routine hike, just a day out in the woods, a few miles of walking, fresh air, and a bit of quiet. I didn't expect it to turn into something that would make me second-guess every step I've taken in nature. I've hiked alone before, plenty of times, but this time felt different. The trail was marked clearly on the map, a simple, straightforward path through the woods, winding up into the hills. The weather had been perfect, cool, overcast skies that kept the heat at bay. I started early, hoping to get the hike in and back before dark. The parking lot at the trailhead was almost empty, which I found odd for a Saturday morning, but I figured most people preferred to sleep in. I set off down the trail with the usual anticipation, the sound of gravel crunching underfoot, the scent of pine in the air, and the quiet hum of the forest around me. It wasn't long before the path narrowed, the trees towering overhead, their trunks thick with age. The trail was mostly uphill, and after a while my legs began to burn, but I was used to it. I paced myself, stopping occasionally to catch my breath, drink water, and take in the views of the valley below. The higher I climbed, the more isolated it felt. I hadn't seen anyone since the trailhead, and no one had passed me on the way up. I didn't think much of it at first, but as the trail turned more into a series of switchbacks, the feeling of being alone started to settle in. There was no sound except for my footsteps and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. It wasn't unnerving at first, but it became clear that something about this hike was different from others I'd done. The further I went, the more I noticed the subtle changes in the landscape. The air grew heavier, and the shadows of the trees stretched longer, even though it was still early. I hadn't checked my watch in a while, but I was sure I had plenty of time before the sun started to dip. But there was something off about the forest, something quiet. The birds had stopped singing, and the usual hum of insects had faded. It was just me and the trees now, and the feeling of being watched slowly crept in. The trail began to get steeper, and soon I was struggling to catch my breath with each step. I took a break, leaning against a boulder that jutted out of the earth. The moment I stopped moving, the silence felt overwhelming. Not a single bird call, not a whisper of wind through the trees. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My instincts were telling me to turn around, but I shook it off. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me, nothing to worry about. But that nagging feeling didn't go away. It only grew stronger as I continued upwards. The trail flattened out for a moment, giving me a brief sense of relief, but then I noticed something unusual. The tracks. They weren't human tracks, at least not from a hiker. They were large, deep prints, like something heavy had been walking through the area. I crouched down to examine them more closely. The shape wasn't quite right. There was something odd about the width of the print, as if it had been made by something bigger than a human but not quite an animal either. It didn't make sense, but I convinced myself it was just a bear track. Bears were common in this area, after all. I continued on, pushing through the unease, my pace picking up as I neared the summit. The trail began to ascend sharply again, and I struggled to keep my breath steady. That's when I saw it, just ahead, in a small clearing off to the side of the trail, a structure. A cabin, old and worn, tucked into the trees. I had no idea there was a cabin up here, and it wasn't on any map I had seen. It was an eerie sight, like something out of a forgotten past, half sunken into the earth, its wooden walls cracked and splintered. My curiosity got the better of me, and I made my way toward the cabin. The closer I got, the more I felt like it was calling to me in some strange way. The air around it was thicker, and the trees surrounding it grew denser, almost as if they were trying to keep the cabin hidden from view. I paused at the threshold, peering inside. There was nothing in there, no furniture, no belongings. It was empty, except for the dust and debris that had accumulated over the years. But what caught my attention was something that didn't belong. A small pile of rocks sat in the center of the floor, arranged in a perfect circle. My heart began to race. It didn't make any sense. Who would leave something like that? And why? I backed away from the cabin slowly, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I turned back toward the trail, my heart pounding in my chest, but when I took a step forward, I froze. The woods, the trees around me were different now. The air had changed, and I could no longer hear the faint rustle of leaves or the occasional bird. It was just silent. I felt a jolt of panic shoot through me. The path ahead seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't match the map. I glanced at my watch, and the time didn't add up. I should have been closer to the summit by now, but it felt like I had been walking in circles. The dread started to creep in, that sinking feeling that I wasn't alone, that I wasn't just lost in the woods. I was being watched, and the more I looked around, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The trail now appeared different from when I had first seen it. There were no clear markings, no obvious path to follow. I walked in the direction I thought was correct, trying to retrace my steps, but it only felt like the forest was pushing me deeper. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisted like dark fingers, blocking out the sky. The air grew colder, and I realized I couldn't hear anything anymore. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just the steady sound of my breath and my footsteps, echoing too loudly in the silence. I found myself heading downhill. It wasn't the same path I had come up on, but I was too disoriented to care. The more I walked, the more the panic set in. I couldn't remember which way I had come from. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, and my body felt heavy with dread. The rustling of leaves was gone, and every step felt like it took an eternity. That's when I saw it again. A set of tracks, larger than before, leading off the trail and into the dense underbrush. I followed them cautiously, my mind racing. What was this? I had never seen anything like it before. It was like an animal, but there was something about it that didn't add up. The prints were too deep, the spacing too irregular. It was as if something had been pacing back and forth, waiting. I kept moving, following the tracks, hoping they would lead me back to the trail. My breath was ragged, and my legs were shaking from the adrenaline. The forest around me seemed alive now, shifting, watching. Then I heard a sound, a snap of a twig behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the trees, the deep, suffocating trees that felt like they were closing in. I kept walking, faster now, desperate to find my way out. The sky above was darkening, and I realized that I was running out of time. It was only then that I saw the familiar shape of the trailhead ahead. The The small parking lot, my car parked in the same spot where I left it. I almost collapsed with relief. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking as I pulled open the door of my car and slammed it shut behind me. I took a moment to breathe, trying to calm my racing mind. What had happened? Why had everything felt so off? The cabin, the strange tracks, the overwhelming silence. I didn't have the answers, but I didn't need them. All I knew was that I would never hike that trail again. The air was cooler than usual when I stepped onto the trail, the trees around me dense and towering. I didn't mind the chill. It was refreshing. I'd been hiking for hours, slowly making my way through a stretch of remote wilderness I had been wanting to explore for months. The trail was relatively quiet, save for the sound of birds in the trees and the crunch of dirt underfoot. It wasn't the first time I'd hiked out here, but it was the first time I'd chosen a route that ventured deeper into the woods, far beyond the familiar paths. I was hoping for peace, for quiet, and maybe some time to reflect. My pack was light, just enough supplies to last me the day. I wasn't planning on camping overnight. There was no rush. I was enjoying the solitude, away from everything else. As I walked deeper into the forest, the trees grew denser, their branches interlacing high above me, blocking out most of the sunlight. The occasional rustle of leaves filled the air, and the only other sound was the soft trickle of a nearby stream I could hear in the distance. I came across a small clearing and decided to take a break. I set down my pack, found a log to sit on, and pulled out a water bottle. The quiet was almost deafening. It was one of those rare moments when everything around you seems still, almost frozen in time. I let my mind wander for a bit, taking in the peaceful surroundings. After a short break, I decided to continue. The trail wasn't marked well, but I had my map and knew the general direction to go. The next part of the trail took me through a patch of thicker brush. The ground here was uneven, covered in thick roots and small rocks that made every step feel like a careful maneuver. I could hear the faint sound of a creek nearby, but the thick underbrush kept me from seeing it. I pressed on, the trees growing taller, and the air becoming slightly heavier. The feeling of isolation was becoming more intense, but it wasn't unsettling. In fact, I welcomed it. The path started to curve around the side of a hill, leading me into a small ravine. The trail was barely visible now, a series of narrow tracks left by the occasional hiker or animal. It was clear that not many people made it this far into the woods. I was starting to feel like I had stepped off the map, like this was a place that existed beyond civilization's reach. And then I heard something. It was faint, a rustling sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind or an animal passing through the underbrush. But then it came again, closer this time. A low, dragging sound. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped and listened. The sound stopped too, leaving only the wind rustling through the trees. My instincts told me to keep moving, but something inside me felt off. I pressed forward, but the noise came again. It was louder this time, unmistakably close. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I could hear heavy breathing now, just beyond the brush. Something or someone was definitely there. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but my mind raced. Could be a wild animal. Maybe a bear? No, it sounded too close. My body tensed as I tried to calm myself. I kept walking, my steps careful and deliberate, hoping I was just imagining things. Then I saw it. A figure moved through the trees, just a shadow at first, but then it became clearer. It was a person. No, not a person. Something was off about them. They were dragging something behind them, and their posture was strange. They were bent forward, moving in an erratic manner. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea who this person was or what they were doing out here, but everything inside me screamed that I needed to leave. My mind raced through all the possible scenarios, none of them comforting. I slowly started to back away, making sure to stay as quiet as possible. The person didn't seem to notice me yet. I kept my eyes on them, my breath shallow. As I backed up, I misjudged a step and tripped over a rock. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I cursed under my breath, scrambling to get back on my feet. But when I looked up, the figure was gone. Gone. Just like that. I stood still, straining my ears for any sound. But the forest around me had returned to its eerie quiet. My mind was racing, trying to process what I'd seen. I was sure I hadn't imagined it. There was no mistaking the figure, even if I couldn't fully make out their face or details. Whoever or whatever they weren't supposed to be there. I stood in place for a while, trying to decide what to do next. My gut told me to leave, but I couldn't just turn around without knowing for sure what had happened. I hesitated, torn between fear and the need to understand. I decided to head back to the clearing I had passed earlier, where I felt safer. The hike back felt longer than it should have. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the leaves made my pulse race. But the woods were quiet again. No sounds of footsteps or breathing, just the occasional bird call. As I made my way back, I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was just a hunter or some other hiker. But deep down, I knew I hadn't seen any hunting gear. No backpack. Nothing that would indicate they were just passing through. When I finally reached the clearing, I paused and looked around. The sun was lower in the sky now, casting long shadows across the ground. It was getting late, and I needed to make my way back to the trailhead before dark. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. Every movement in the trees seemed like someone or something watching me. I started to make my way back down the trail, but as I reached a particularly narrow part of the path, I heard the dragging sound again. This time, it was unmistakable. It was closer, almost right behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Then I heard it again, louder this time, as if it were following me. I felt the blood rush to my ears, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The sound was unmistakable now, something heavy being dragged through the brush. I started walking faster, then jogging. My eyes darted around, but the forest was still, except for that sound. It was growing louder, closer. I broke into a full sprint. My pack bounced wildly against my back as I ran down the trail. The sound followed, dragging relentlessly behind me. My mind was a blur of panic. The trees began to thin out as I approached the edge of the forest. I saw the trailhead in the distance, the parking lot with my car just beyond it. I could make it. I had to make it. I ran faster, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air, but the dragging sound was still there, still following me, getting closer with each step. I reached the clearing, the edge of the forest now within sight. My feet hit the dirt path hard as I tore through the final stretch. Just as I reached the tree's edge, I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. The dragging sound had stopped. I stood there, panting, heart pounding, eyes wide as I looked around. There was no sign of anyone behind me. The trailhead was just a few steps away. I didn't stop running until I was in my car. The door slammed shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, my breath still shallow. The forest looked peaceful again, calm, as though nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. Whoever or whatever was out there, they were gone now. The night fell around me as I drove away from that place, the memory of what I'd seen and heard lingering in the quiet of my car. I didn't know what I'd encountered out there, but I wasn't going back. Not anytime soon. I made it home that night, shaken but safe. And I never spoke of what happened on that hike to anyone, but every time I think about it, I wonder if I was just too close to something that was never meant to be found. Something that belongs to the woods, to the land, far beyond where most people dare to go. I decided to go on a solo hiking trip through a trail I'd never explored before. It wasn't a popular route, but I figured that would make it more exciting, just me, the wilderness, and my thoughts. The weather was supposed to be clear, and I had packed enough supplies for a couple of days. I was feeling good, ready for the challenge, but looking back now, I can see how many small things I overlooked that led to a much more dangerous situation than I ever expected. The trail started out easy enough, winding through thick trees and uneven ground. The air was fresh, and the forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the chirp of distant birds. I liked the solitude. It was just what I needed after a few stressful months at work. I hadn't really thought much about the dangers of being alone in such a remote area. That's one thing I learned: complacency is a killer. The first few hours passed without incident. I stopped now and then to take pictures of the scenery, but there was nothing unusual. At first, the trail was wide enough to give me the illusion of safety. But as I continued, the path narrowed, the trees thickened, and the sounds of civilization began to fade. All I could hear now was the occasional snap of a twig underfoot, the wind rustling through the leaves, and the distant call of birds. The deeper I went into the forest, the more it seemed like I was the only person there. It was quiet, too quiet. I didn't like that feeling. It wasn't fear exactly, it was more of an unease, like I was being watched. The air was growing heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the sense of isolation was starting to feel suffocating. After a while, the trail began to climb and the landscape changed. The trees were shorter here, replaced by brush and scattered boulders. I could see the distant mountains through the gaps in the trees, the slopes dotted with patches of snow. I paused to catch my breath, taking in the view. It was beautiful, but I couldn't ignore the fact that I was getting farther from any kind of help. It was around noon when things started to take a turn for the worse. I was still climbing, and the terrain had become steeper. The path was barely there now, just a series of loose rocks and overgrown grass. I had to pay close attention to where I stepped, carefully choosing my footing as I moved forward. My legs were starting to feel the strain, but I pushed on. I had come this far, and I wasn't about to turn back now. The weather had been clear when I set out, but as I moved higher, I could feel the temperature drop. The sky had started to cloud over, and a thick fog was rolling in from the valley below. The visibility dropped dramatically, and the once bright sun was now hidden behind a heavy layer of gray. I glanced at my phone, but there was no signal. I couldn't even tell what time it was anymore, and I began to realize just how isolated I was. I decided to keep moving, hoping that the fog would lift, but it only got worse. The trail was becoming harder to follow. I had been relying on markers along the way, but they were becoming harder to spot. Each step seemed to take me deeper into the fog, and I started to feel disoriented. The only sound I could hear now was my breathing and the crunch of gravel underfoot. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, but everything was a blur of gray and white. I couldn't even tell which direction I had come from. After a while, the fog began to feel oppressive. I had no idea how far I had traveled or how long I had been walking. I had no landmarks to guide me, and the further I went, the more I started to panic. I had no choice but to stop and sit down for a moment to collect myself. I pulled out my map and compass, hoping to figure out where I was. But as I unfolded the map, I realized with growing horror that I had no idea which direction I was facing. I had gotten so turned around that I couldn't even make sense of my surroundings. The compass didn't help either. It spun wildly, as though the magnetic forces of the mountain were throwing it off. I felt a cold knot of dread in my stomach as I realized just how lost I was. I tried to calm myself down. Panicking wouldn't help, but the more I tried to steady my breathing, the more I felt the weight of the situation bearing down on me. I had no idea where I was, no way to tell which direction would lead me to safety. And as the fog continued to thicken, I couldn't even see the trail anymore. The trees had disappeared, and I was surrounded by nothing but mist. The hours passed, or at least I thought they did. I couldn't tell how much time had passed, but my legs were growing sore from the constant movement, and I felt my energy beginning to fade. I had been walking aimlessly for what felt like an eternity. It was like the fog was swallowing me whole, and every time I thought I saw a break in the mist, it closed in again, even denser than before. I had to make a decision. I couldn't keep walking without a plan. I stopped in my tracks, feeling the weight of my pack on my shoulders. I could feel my water bottle getting lighter, and I realized I hadn't eaten anything all day. I still had some snacks, but I was beginning to ration them, unsure of how long I would be stuck out here. I decided to make camp. It seemed like my best option. I couldn't keep walking without any direction, and I wasn't about to risk exhausting myself further. I found a small clearing, though the trees around it were still thick. I gathered some branches and tried to make a small fire, But with the damp air and the thick fog, the fire refused to catch. I tried several times, but it was hopeless. At that point, the fog wasn't just a nuisance, it was a real danger. If I couldn't get out soon, I would be stuck here for who knows how long. Nightfall came unexpectedly fast. The temperature dropped even further, and I could feel the chill creeping into my bones. I tried to keep warm by wrapping myself in my jacket and huddling against the rocks, but the cold seeped in no matter what I did. The fog didn't lift, and I felt more alone than I ever had in my life. There was no sound now, just the eerie silence of the fog pressing in around me. I lay there in the darkness, eyes wide open, listening for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just silence, complete, suffocating silence. The next morning, I woke up to the same fog. It had never cleared. I packed up my things quickly, feeling a sense of urgency like I never had before. I couldn't stay there any longer, but the fog made it impossible to see anything ahead of me. I couldn't even remember which way I had come from the previous day. I knew I needed to make it back to the main trail, but the question was, which way was that? I decided to trust my instincts and choose a direction, hoping I was going the right way. My legs were stiff and sore, and I could feel the weight of exhaustion pulling at me with each step. Hours passed again. I couldn't tell how many, but I was beginning to feel the strain of not knowing where I was going. The fog hadn't cleared, but I felt like I was slowly gaining some traction. Maybe it was just the hope of getting out that kept me moving, but I kept telling myself I had to keep going. And then, just as I was beginning to lose hope, I saw it, the faintest outline of a signpost through the mist. My heart skipped a beat. It was one of the trail markers I had been looking for. I had found my way back. With renewed energy, I made my way toward it, the relief I felt almost overwhelming. I wasn't out of the woods yet, but I was getting closer to safety. By the time I finally reached the signpost, I saw the familiar markings of the main trail. My legs were shaking with exhaustion, but I had made it. I wasn't lost anymore. I kept moving, determined to reach the end of the trail and back to civilization. The fog was still there, but I didn't care anymore. I had found my way back. Eventually, the fog began to clear as I made my way down the mountain, and I could see the familiar landscape stretching out before me. It was like I had been given a second chance, a reminder that nature was unforgiving and that no amount of preparation could fully prepare you for what it could throw at you. By the time I made it to the base of the trail, I was exhausted, but I was grateful. I had made it through the worst of it. I had learned a hard lesson about respecting the wilderness, about being prepared for anything and everything. The next time I went hiking, I knew I would be more cautious, more aware, and maybe, just maybe, I would never take the safety of the trail for granted again. I set out for the trail on an overcast morning, the kind of weather that didn't quite make you feel like staying in bed, but didn't exactly promise a clear day either. It was a Saturday, and after a stressful week at work, I felt the need to get away from the city and lose myself in nature for a while. The trail I chose was a moderately difficult loop, about a 6-mile stretch through dense woods, with a steep incline toward the middle. I had done this hike before and remembered it being challenging but manageable. A good way to clear my head. The air was cool, and there was a slight mist hanging in the trees. The path, at first, was wide and well-marked, winding through a mixture of oak and pine. My boots made a soft thudding sound as they hit the dirt, and the smell of fresh earth filled the air. I passed a few other hikers in the first mile, but they were all headed back toward the trailhead, likely turning around before the steepest part of the hike. I didn't mind. I enjoyed hiking alone. It gave me time to think, and on this particular day, I had a lot on my mind. The first few miles were uneventful, just the rhythm of my steps and the sound of the wind whispering through the trees. As I climbed higher into the hills, the forest grew denser, and the trail became steeper. I had to stop a few times to catch my breath. There's something about hiking uphill that forces you to be present. Each step requires focus, and every few minutes, I had to remind myself to keep my pace steady and not rush it. The view was amazing, though. The trees below seemed to stretch forever, and I could see patches of the valley in between breaks in the canopy. The mist hung in the distance like a blanket, softening everything, giving it an almost ethereal look. By the time I reached the halfway point, I was sweating a little. The trail had narrowed and twisted, becoming less obvious in some places. It was clear that not many people went this far. There was no trash or broken branches. The sound of the wind had died down, and I was left with only the sound of my footsteps and the occasional bird call. I could feel the weight of the solitude settling in. It was different from the usual peace I felt when I hiked alone. This felt empty in a way. There was a quiet that made my skin prickle. I decided to stop and drink some water. The only sounds around me were the distant rustling of leaves and the quiet, rhythmic beat of my heart. I didn't know why, but the silence felt thicker now, like it was pressing in on me. I glanced behind me, expecting to see the rest of the trail stretching back down. But the trees had grown thick enough that I couldn't make out the path I'd just come from. My thoughts began to drift, and I found myself wondering what exactly I was hoping to find on this hike. Escape? Clarity? Something more? As I stood there, taking a sip from my water bottle, I heard it, a noise in the distance. It sounded like the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. At first, I dismissed it. Maybe another hiker? But the trail was narrow, and I hadn't seen anyone for a while. Still, I told myself not to jump to conclusions. I had been on the trail many times before, and you can never be too sure about the noises of the forest. I continued my climb, pushing through the feeling of unease that lingered in my chest. The trail twisted once more, and as I rounded the bend, the path seemed to open up into a small clearing. The sky above was visible now, but the sun was still hidden behind the cloud cover. The clearing was quiet, almost unnervingly so, and I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling that something wasn't quite right. That's when I saw the first sign that something was wrong. A large rock lay at the center of the clearing, its surface rough and dark. But it wasn't the rock that caught my attention, it was what was next to it. A small pile of branches, carefully arranged, almost as though someone had placed them there. I knew from experience that hikers didn't tend to build things like this on the trail, especially not in the middle of nowhere. The pile wasn't huge, but it was odd enough to make me pause. I stepped closer, my boots crunching the dry earth underfoot. There was something unsettling about the way the branches were arranged, as if someone had been there recently or maybe even watching. The thought made my skin prickle again. My mind raced, and I tried to push the thought out of my head, focusing on the task at hand. But then, as I took another step, the branches shifted slightly. I froze, heart racing. Had I imagined it? The wind didn't seem strong enough to move them. I crouched down to get a better look, and that's when I noticed something strange. A small piece of fabric caught in the branches. It was a faded red, like the kind of shirt someone might wear on a hike. I reached for it, instinctively, and as my fingers brushed the fabric, a jolt of panic shot through me. I wasn't alone. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. I wasn't alone on this trail. My eyes scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement, any indication of who or what had been here. But there was nothing. The clearing was still too still. I straightened up, my breath coming in short gasps. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. Who had been here? Why had they left? Was someone watching me right now? I didn't want to think about it, but the nagging fear clawed at my chest. My instincts told me to turn around and head back the way I came. But the trail was unfamiliar now, the trees too dense and the air too heavy. I started walking again, my steps quickening. I didn't care about the view or the climb anymore. I just wanted to get off the mountain. The path, however, didn't seem to get any easier. It was steep and twisting, and every turn seemed to bring me farther from the trailhead, not closer. The sense of unease continued to grow, an almost palpable feeling that I was being watched, followed. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Time didn't seem to matter anymore. My pace grew frantic, my breathing shallow. The quiet was broken only by the pounding of my heart in my ears, the occasional crunch of dry leaves underfoot. I started to hear something behind me again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, like someone was trailing just out of sight. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there. I tried to push the panic down, to keep moving forward, but the sense of being hunted only deepened. My legs burned from the climb, but I couldn't stop now. I couldn't let whoever or whatever was behind me catch up. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I spotted the trailhead in the distance. The trees opened up, and I could see the parking lot and the road beyond. I pushed harder, ignoring the ache in my muscles, and finally broke through the tree line. When I reached my car, I didn't look back. I threw my backpack in the trunk, slammed the door, and drove away, my heart still racing. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. But there was no one. The road was empty, and the forest seemed peaceful again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't been alone on that trail, that someone had been watching me the entire time. It was the kind of day that made me second-guess every decision I'd ever made. The morning had started off so normal. The sun barely peeked through the trees as I pulled my backpack over my shoulders, the weight of it reassuring. I'd been planning this hike for weeks, a solo venture into the dense woods that bordered the outskirts of town. No one else seemed to be around, which, in hindsight, should have been a warning sign. The trail was narrow at first, just a faint path carved by a few others who had walked before me. Leaves crunched beneath my boots as I followed the path deeper into the woods, the occasional bird call the only sound breaking the quiet. It wasn't a long trail. At least that's what I had been told. I expected a few hours of solitude and fresh air, nothing more. Yet, as I walked, I began to notice small things I couldn't quite put my finger on but felt unsettling. The trees grew thicker as I ventured further in. The sun started to fade behind clouds that had somehow gathered too quickly. It was odd, I thought, but I wasn't overly concerned. I'd hiked before, and while I wasn't experienced in the way some were, I knew enough to keep my wits about me. My water bottle was half full, and I had a snack bar stashed in my pack. Plenty for the couple of hours I expected to be out. But as I continued, I started noticing the silence. It wasn't the peaceful silence of the woods, where every rustle of a leaf or chirp of a squirrel filled the air. No, this silence was different. It was the absence of any sound, like the world had simply stopped. The birds stopped singing, and the wind no longer rustled the trees. I stopped walking for a moment, listening. My heart began to pick up speed, the pulse in my chest louder than anything around me. I shifted the straps of my backpack nervously. I shook my head, trying to dispel the unease. It was nothing. I kept walking, the trail winding through the trees now, dipping down into a small hollow. The ground became uneven, and I had to step carefully over the occasional root that stretched out like fingers grasping at my legs. There was something strange about the place now. The air felt thick, heavy, almost as if it was pressing in from all sides. My skin prickled, a feeling I couldn't shake. Then I saw it, a shape up ahead, a large rock formation that looked completely out of place. It wasn't part of the trail map, and it seemed to rise unnaturally from the forest floor, like something had just shoved it out of the earth. I approached cautiously, curiosity outweighing my growing sense of discomfort. The rock was smooth, almost polished, with strange, angular cuts running along its surface. It didn't belong. I reached out a hand, fingers brushing the cold surface, when I felt it, a shift in the air, a sudden pressure that made my chest feel tight. I pulled my hand back, staring at the rock. That's when I noticed something strange at the base of it, an opening. It was too perfect to be natural, a small crack that formed into a narrow tunnel leading deep into the rock. I froze. A sense of danger crept up my spine, like a warning my brain was desperately trying to ignore. Should I check it out? I stood there for a few moments, weighing the options in my head. I was alone. I had no reason to believe anything was off. Yet, deep down, I felt a primal urge to turn back. But I ignored it, stepping closer to the tunnel. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every step seemed heavier than the last. Just a quick look, I thought. But as I neared the entrance, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. A faint shimmer at the edge of the tunnel, like something wet was glistening just inside. A noise, A soft, scraping sound, almost imperceptible, echoed from within the darkness. I swallowed hard, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But my feet, for reasons I couldn't explain, took me closer. I crouched, peering into the tunnel, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was dark, and I couldn't see much, but that shimmer was there again, like something was moving. A cold chill ran down my spine. I didn't want to go further. I didn't, but something in my gut told me that I had to. Something was pulling me in. I glanced behind me. The trail was still visible, but I felt isolated, alone. The forest had become unnervingly still. I could hear my own breath, shallow and quick, and the blood pounding in my ears. I couldn't resist the pull. I stepped into the tunnel, the air colder than I expected. The ground was uneven, my boots scraping against the rough stone as I moved deeper. The tunnel seemed to curve, narrowing as I went. The farther I went, the less light there was. Then I felt it, a sudden, intense pressure on my chest, like something heavy was pressing down. The air was thinner now, harder to breathe. I had to turn back. I spun around, but the way out wasn't the same. The entrance I had passed through was no longer visible. Instead, the tunnel stretched on endlessly. Panic started to rise in my chest, sharp and fierce. I wasn't sure what was happening. Was this some kind of trick? I began to walk faster, my steps echoing in the tunnel. But with each step, the air seemed to close in on me. The ground felt softer now, as though I was walking through mud, but I couldn't remember it being this way before. My breath came in gasps. I wasn't alone. I didn't know how I knew, but I could feel eyes on me. Not from behind, but from all around. Something was there, in the darkness, watching me. I stumbled forward, tripping on something hard that I hadn't seen. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my palms as I caught myself. I had to get out, but the tunnel was closing in. The walls felt closer, and the air grew heavier with each breath. Then, as if some unseen force was finally giving way, I saw a faint light ahead. I ran. The tunnel twisted again, but I didn't care. I could see the exit, the trees, the daylight. I wasn't sure how long I had been in there, but it felt like hours. With a final burst of strength, I threw myself through the opening. I stumbled out into the sunlight, gasping for air, my heart racing. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath. The forest seemed alive again. The sounds of birds chirping, the wind rustling the leaves, the familiar feeling of safety that I had come to expect. But that moment didn't last long. I didn't feel safe. Something had followed me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt a weight pressing down on me, like I was being watched. The feeling didn't fade when I looked around, and my unease only grew when I realized that the trail I had been following was now completely gone. The forest was unfamiliar. I was lost. The sense of danger, of being surrounded, had only intensified. I pulled my backpack tighter, gripping the straps until my fingers ached. The sun was low in the sky now, casting long shadows over the ground. I had no idea which direction I had come from. I couldn't go back the way I had come. It took what felt like hours of walking, but eventually, I stumbled upon a faint trail. It was overgrown, barely visible, but it was something. With no other choice, I followed it. The forest had grown quieter again, and the familiar sounds were missing once more. Every step I took felt like it was dragging me deeper into a place I didn't belong. When I finally saw a clearing ahead, my heart nearly stopped. The trail ended abruptly at the edge of a small ravine, a drop that I hadn't seen before. I had no idea how far it went down, but I could hear the faint sound of rushing water beneath. There was no way down. I turned to look behind me, but the forest looked different now. The trees were unfamiliar, their twisted forms towering above me like silent watchers. Then I heard something. It was faint, at first, like the sound of footsteps, slowly, steadily coming closer. I wasn't alone. I bolted toward the ravine, my heart in my throat. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and I could hear something else now. A low, distant growl that seemed to echo off the trees. I ran. The path twisted and turned, but I didn't stop. My legs burned, and my breath came in ragged gasps, but I didn't dare look back. Somehow, I found the edge of the trail again, and I pushed through the underbrush, making my way through the trees until I finally reached the clearing near the parking lot. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The woods had given me no answers, only fear, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting. But I was safe, for now, and that was enough. I didn't plan on going alone. I never do. But that day, it just felt right to go on a solo hike. The weather was perfect. A cool, clear morning with the sun just starting to climb into the sky. I had been feeling out of sorts for the last couple of weeks, restless, cooped up in the usual daily grind. I needed a change of pace, and I knew this trail was one of the quieter ones, far from the usual crowds that always seem to follow the popular routes. I packed my gear the night before: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a map, and my trusty pocket knife. I didn't think I'd need much more. It wasn't a long trail, just a few hours out and back. The trailhead was a little hidden, tucked away in a forest that wasn't frequently traveled. That was exactly why I chose it. It was the kind of place where I could be alone with my thoughts. As I drove out, the last of the city's noise faded away. The road narrowed, becoming gravel, then dirt, and soon the only sound I could hear was the wind through the trees and the occasional chirp of birds. I parked at the small trailhead, an unmarked gravel lot that barely fit 2 cars. I checked my pack one last time, adjusted the straps, and set off. The forest was thick, dense trees that blocked much of the sunlight, leaving the trail in a quiet, shadowed green. The air smelled like pine, damp earth, and something else. Something earthy, but I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't unpleasant, just strange. Felt good to be out there, away from the distractions of life. My boots crunched over the dry leaves, and the world seemed to grow smaller, more contained with each step. I could feel my mind starting to quiet. The first hour or so was easy. The trail wound through the forest in a gentle descent, the path clear and easy to follow. There were no signs of other hikers, which didn't surprise me. This trail wasn't exactly a hidden gem, but it wasn't well known either. I kept a steady pace, breathing deeply and focusing on the rhythm of my steps. As the trail began to curve, I noticed something odd, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The air grew thicker, almost still. The wind seemed to stop moving altogether, and there was an odd heaviness in the silence. I paused for a moment, feeling the hair on the back of my neck rise slightly. It was nothing, I told myself, just a moment of unease. I took a deep breath and kept walking, but something was different. The forest felt closed off. The trees were taller here, their branches arching overhead, blocking most of the sunlight. The trail became more rugged too, the dirt more loose, and the underbrush thick with ferns and low-growing plants. I glanced at my map to make sure I was still on the right track. There were no other trails branching off, just one winding path leading deeper into the forest. I checked my watch. It had been almost 2 hours since I started. I was far enough in now that turning back didn't seem like an easy option. The next stretch of trail grew steeper. It wasn't dangerous, just a series of rocky steps that required a bit of scrambling. The sound of my breathing was the only thing I could hear now, each breath coming a little heavier. I paused at the top of the incline to drink some water, wiping the sweat from my brow. I glanced back down the trail, but the view was obscured by trees. That's when I heard it, a soft crackling sound, like dry leaves being disturbed. It was faint, but unmistakable. My first thought was that it might be an animal, a deer maybe, or a squirrel, but there was no movement in the trees, no rustling of branches. I stood still, listening, trying to locate the sound, but it was gone as quickly as it came. I shook my head and convinced myself it was nothing. It had to be wind or some small animal in the underbrush. I couldn't let myself get spooked this early into the hike. But as I continued, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It wasn't the usual sensation you get when you're alone in the woods, where you just feel aware of the surroundings. This felt different, like I wasn't entirely alone. The trail took another turn, and soon I was walking along the edge of a steep hill, looking down at the forest below. The trees were denser down there, and I could just make out the glint of a creek winding through the valley. The air felt cooler as I descended into the ravine, and the silence deepened. Then there it was again, the crackling sound. Only this time it was louder. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. I could feel the tension in my chest, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. Just trees, ferns, and rocks. I looked around, scanning the area, but all I saw were the same old woods. I took a few cautious steps forward, but then something shifted to my left. It was quick, just the briefest movement of something large. A shadow, a figure, a blur between the trees. Panic hit me like a wave. I froze. My instincts told me to run, but I couldn't make my legs move. I stared at the spot where I'd seen the movement, but there was nothing now. Only the trees. The wind, which had been dead still earlier, picked up again, rustling the leaves. The noise was almost deafening, making it harder to focus. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, or maybe the wind moving something, but I couldn't. I knew what I had seen, or thought I had seen. I pulled myself together, trying to shake the fear that was gripping me. I couldn't let my mind get the better of me out here. This was just a little bump in the road. I had to keep going. I pushed forward, telling myself that I'd be fine, that there was nothing to worry about. But the farther I went, the more the atmosphere shifted. The woods seemed to close in tighter, the shadows deeper. The crackling sound started again, this time accompanied by a low, almost imperceptible growl. I froze once more. The noise was coming from somewhere ahead, just off the trail. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel something heavy, something predatory. My breath quickened as I looked around, trying to spot anything that might be hiding in the underbrush. But there was nothing. I couldn't explain it, but I knew deep down that I wasn't alone anymore. Whatever it was following me. I had to make a decision. Should I turn back? Should I risk it and push forward? I weighed the options. The air had shifted again. It was colder now, and the sounds of the forest had quieted, leaving an unsettling silence. I took a few steps back toward the way I came. That's when I heard the unmistakable snap of a twig. Not from the trail, but from the trees to my left. I spun around and saw nothing, but I could feel it. I could feel eyes on me. I knew I wasn't imagining it anymore. I started walking faster, trying not to panic. I didn't know what was out there, but the fear was real. Every step felt heavier as I quickened my pace, but it didn't matter. The crackling noises followed me, and no matter how fast I went, they seemed to be getting closer. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, anything, stalking me. But there was nothing. Just the trees, the trail, the shadows. It was only when I reached the clearing at the end of the trail that I allowed myself to stop. I wasn't sure why the sound had stopped, why the tension had eased, but I could finally breathe. I looked around, taking in the small clearing. The sun had started to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the scene. My eyes fell on the small creek running through the valley below, the peaceful gurgling sound almost soothing. I hadn't realized how tense I had been, how tightly I had gripped my pack straps. Slowly, I let go of the anxiety that had been holding me. I stood there for a moment, taking in the view and the silence of the forest around me. I didn't know what had followed me or what I had sensed, but I was relieved to be standing in that clearing, with daylight still fading but not yet gone. The walk back was uneventful, and the sounds that had unnerved me earlier faded away with the daylight. The sense of being watched left me as I approached the trailhead, where my car was parked. As I drove back down the winding road, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the experience pressing in. I would never fully explain what happened. Maybe it had been a trick of the mind, the isolation of the forest making me hyper-aware of every sound. Or maybe it was something else. Either way, the forest had been quiet once more, as if nothing had ever happened. But I would never hike that trail again. I've always been an outdoors kind of person. The air in the mountains feels different, cleaner, almost. It was a Friday afternoon when I set off to hike the more remote trails in the national park. Most people took the well-trodden paths, but not me. I liked the challenge of going where few others had gone, where the trees were thicker and the sounds quieter. The weather was perfect for it. Clear skies, the sun not too hot, a breeze that kept the air moving just enough to cool the skin. I had everything I needed: water, a small pack with snacks, a jacket in case the temperature dropped, and of course my trusty map. It was a well-marked trail, but not as popular as others. I liked that. It was about 3 hours into the wilderness, and I could already tell I wasn't going to encounter any large crowds. There was a certain feeling I liked about that isolation. When you're alone, the noises of the world fall away, and it feels like you're entering a space that belongs to nobody but you. I'd felt this way on other hikes, but this trail felt different from the start. First, everything was normal. The usual sounds of birds, the occasional rustle of leaves as a small animal moved through the brush. But as I moved further in, the sounds began to change. Not in a way that felt alarming at first, just quieter. The birds had stopped singing. The breeze, usually so constant, had gone still. I pushed forward, not thinking much of it. Maybe it was just the area. The deeper into the woods you go, the more isolated it feels, right? But even then, I started noticing how the trees seemed to close in on me. The trail wasn't narrow, but it sure felt like it. The canopy overhead thickened, and the light began to fade despite it still being early afternoon. I stopped for a moment, pulled out my water bottle, and took a drink. I looked around at the trees, tall, ancient pines and oaks. There was something about them, something that seemed wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air had a heaviness to it now, like it was thick with something unspoken. It wasn't quite fear yet, but an odd sense of unease crept up my spine. Shaking off the feeling, I moved forward. The trail was still clear, and my boots made that rhythmic crunching sound as I moved along the dirt path. But it wasn't just the physical trail that was beginning to feel strange. It was the silence. No birds, no small critters rustling through the leaves. Just that unnerving quiet. It wasn't until I came to a bend in the trail that I stopped dead in my tracks. The area opened up a bit, revealing a small clearing. But something was off. The trees around the clearing looked older than the others, their bark gnarled and twisted. In the center of the clearing stood a large stone, jagged and uneven, like a forgotten relic of some past era. I'd never seen anything like it before. No markings, no carvings, nothing that suggested it was man-made, but it had a presence to it. A strange, imposing presence. The weird part was it wasn't on the trail. It was like it had just been placed there, an unnatural addition to the landscape. I walked closer, my boots crunching louder on the dirt as I approached it. The air felt colder here, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't want to get too close. Something about the stone made my stomach tighten. It didn't belong here. I turned around and headed back toward the trail, but as I did, I noticed something. The trees on the other side of the clearing, the ones I had passed just a minute ago, weren't where they should be. It was subtle, but the shape of the land had shifted. The path, which had been clear, now seemed to curve unnaturally to the left. I froze, my heart pounding. My map was and my Bach. I pulled it out, unfolding it quickly, my fingers trembling. I checked the markings, the landmarks, and realized the area I was in didn't match up with anything on the map. There was a sense of vertigo as I tried to make sense of it. Was I lost? How could that be? I had been following the trail, and it had always been marked. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady myself. The clearing, the stone, the odd shift in the landscape. It all felt too surreal, but I couldn't ignore the truth. I was lost. The realization hit me hard. I should have turned back after I felt that shift, but the stubborn part of me didn't want to admit that something was off. And now, here I was, standing in the middle of the wilderness with no idea which direction to go. I took a deep breath and forced myself to focus. I could still make it out if I just retraced my steps. I turned back to the trail, but now it wasn't just the physical world that felt wrong. It was the atmosphere. There was a pressure in the air, like something wasn't quite right. The trail seemed longer than it had been, stretching on in a way that didn't make sense. My heart raced as I quickened my pace, my footsteps echoing louder with each step. The trees around me seemed to grow taller, their shadows stretching like dark hands reaching out to grab me. The silence was suffocating. My breath came faster now, and I could feel the panic starting to rise. Suddenly, there was a rustle. My head snapped around, my eyes scanning the woods. But there was nothing, no movement, no creature, nothing. Just the same oppressive quiet. I turned back to the path, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving just out of sight, watching me. The hours stretched on. What had felt like a simple hike had turned into an exhausting ordeal. My muscles ached from the tension, my legs starting to burn from the constant walking. But there was no escape. The path never seemed to end, and it all started to blur together. The same dense woods, the same strange silence. Then, just as I was beginning to think I might be going in circles, I saw it, a break in the trees. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. I broke into a run, my feet pounding the ground, the last reserves of my energy pushing me forward. And then I saw it, the parking lot, the familiar signpost that marked the beginning of the trail. Couldn't believe it. My body was on the edge of collapse, but relief washed over me in a wave. I had made it back. I didn't stop. Couldn't. I kept walking until I was safely in my car, the engine starting up with a hum that felt like music to my ears. As I pulled away from the trailhead, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The woods were dark and still, but they no longer felt like the comforting haven they once had. I knew one thing for sure: I wouldn't be returning to that trail again. I had always been the kind of person who liked to be alone in nature. It wasn't that I hated company, but there was something about the peace and silence of the woods that made me feel more at ease than any crowded street or busy cafe ever could. That morning, I had set out on a solo hike through a remote trail deep in the mountains. It was the kind of hike where you could be hours from any civilization, where the only sounds you'd hear were the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the occasional crunch of dirt beneath your boots. It was exactly what I needed. The weather was perfect when I started, cool but not too cold, with just the right amount of sunlight filtering through the trees. My backpack was light but had everything I needed: some water, a few energy bars, a first aid kit, and a map that I wasn't really planning to use unless I had to. I'd been on this trail before a few years back, so I knew the route. It was supposed to be a simple day hike, nothing too strenuous, just a way to clear my mind. The path was narrow at first, winding through thick underbrush and tall trees. As I moved deeper into the forest, I noticed how still everything seemed. It was like the woods had swallowed up any noise, leaving only the sound of my footsteps. Every now and then, I'd stop to adjust my pack or take a quick drink of water, but mostly, I just kept walking, letting my mind wander. The trail eventually opened up into a small clearing. I paused, stretching my legs and taking in the view. The sun was high now, casting long shadows across the landscape. The trees around the clearing were old, their trunks thick and gnarled, like they had been standing there for centuries. I was about to move on when I noticed something off to my left, a slight disturbance in the underbrush just beyond the tree line. It was nothing at first, just a flicker of movement, like something had brushed past. But it was enough to make me stop. I stood there for a while, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but something felt off. There was an unsettling stillness now, a silence that was different from the peaceful quiet I had been enjoying before. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I took another step forward, then froze again. This time I heard it more clearly, a crack of a branch snapping under weight. My heart skipped. I was alone out here, or at least I was supposed to be. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was probably just some animal moving through the forest, but a part of me couldn't let it go. I stayed where I was for a few moments longer, scanning the trees around me, but there was nothing. No sign of movement, no sound. I decided it was better to keep moving, to keep putting distance between myself and whatever it was. My pace quickened, but it didn't help the sense of unease creeping up my spine. I tried to focus on the path, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that sound. It wasn't like any animal I had encountered before. Not in that area, anyway. The trail began to climb a little, the trees growing thinner and giving way to a rocky outcrop. I paused again, catching my breath as I glanced around. The view was incredible, stretching out over the valley below, but it did little to calm the tension I was feeling. Something wasn't right. I shook my head. This was ridiculous. I had been hiking alone for years, and I had never felt anything like this before. I was overthinking it. It was probably just a squirrel or some other harmless creature that had startled me. I turned away from the view and continued along the path, determined to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. But as the trail curved around the next bend, I noticed something. The air felt different now, thicker, almost suffocating. The once clear sky had been overtaken by clouds, and the sun, which had been so bright just moments ago, was now obscured behind a thick veil of gray. The temperature dropped, and the wind picked up, rustling the leaves in an almost unsettling way. It wasn't the gentle breeze I had felt earlier. It was harsh, like the forest itself was trying to push me back. I had reached a narrow part of the trail, a section where the path squeezed between two towering rock faces. The rocks loomed above me, and the air felt damp, like the moisture was trapped between the stones. I stopped to adjust my pack again, trying to steady my breath. That's when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound, like footsteps, slow and deliberate. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe the wind was playing tricks on me, or maybe it was just the echo of my own steps bouncing off the rocks. But then the sound came again, closer this time. I froze. This wasn't normal. No one else should have been out here. I quickly scanned the area around me, but there was no sign of anyone. Just the rocks, the trees, and the thickening darkness of the forest. My pulse quickened, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The sound came again, this time from just around the corner ahead of me. Something was following me. I didn't stop to think. I just turned and started running. My breath came in short gasps, my feet pounding the dirt as I pushed myself harder. The trail twisted and turned, but I didn't care anymore. I couldn't afford to look back. The sense of being pursued was too strong, too real. I wasn't sure how long I ran, but eventually, I slowed, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. I found myself on a wider part of the trail, a slight ridge that overlooked a ravine below. The sky had darkened further, and the wind howled, pushing against me, urging me to go back. But I didn't want to go back. Not now. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was I hearing things? Or was there someone out there? I glanced over my shoulder, but the path behind me was empty, the shadows stretching across the trail in the fading light. I didn't want to take any chances. I made the decision to turn back. The hike was supposed to be a quick escape, a few hours in nature, but now it felt like a fight for survival. The sense of being watched, of being followed, wouldn't leave me. I began making my way back toward the trailhead, trying to ignore the pounding in my chest. The wind seemed to push against me harder now, and every rustle of leaves made my heart jump. I focused on my footing, trying to stay calm, but it felt like the forest itself was closing in around me. The sun had disappeared completely now, leaving only the gray light of dusk to guide my way. I could barely see the path anymore, the shadows deepening in the trees. The trail that had seemed so familiar earlier now felt foreign, like I was in a completely different place. I had no idea how far I had gone, but I was certain I had gone too deep into the forest. The sounds of the forest had changed. The chirping of birds was gone, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed in on me from all sides. Even the wind had quieted, leaving only the sound of my breathing and the occasional crunch of leaves beneath my boots. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw it, the trailhead, barely visible in the dim light. I pushed forward, stumbling over rocks and roots, my legs aching from the sudden exertion. When I finally stepped out of the woods and into the clearing by the parking lot, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I had made it. I didn't care how dark it had gotten or how strange everything had felt. I was out of the woods. But as I reached my car, I turned back to look at the trail one last time. And that's when I saw it. A shadow just at the edge of the trees. A figure standing still, watching me. My heart stopped. And then, just like that, it disappeared into the woods, as though it had never been there at all. The sun was setting as I set off down the trail, the light casting long shadows over the rocky path that twisted and turned through the dense forest. I had been hiking alone for the better part of the day, but now, in the evening hours, I felt more alone than ever. I had always been drawn to the mountains, to the quiet solitude of nature, and to the feeling of being completely disconnected from the rush of everyday life. But this hike, this particular trail, was starting to feel different. Something about the woods here felt off, like they were watching me, waiting. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The path was narrow, overgrown in places, and I had to duck under low-hanging branches as I moved forward. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to focus on the path ahead, but my eyes kept darting to the trees, to the shadows that seemed to shift just out of the corner of my vision. I wasn't new to hiking, not by a long shot. I had done long solo hikes before, and I prided myself on my ability to stay calm and collected no matter what. But today, I felt like I was pushing the limits. The trail, while well-marked, had started to feel unfamiliar, and I began to question if I had missed a turn or wandered off the path. I checked my map again, even though I had already done so several times that day, and made a mental note of the landmarks ahead. My phone had no signal, which didn't surprise me. The area I was in was known for poor reception, and I had expected it. But it added to the feeling of isolation, the knowledge that if something went wrong, I would be on my own. The further I went, the more the trail seemed to fade. It wasn't like the trail just ended. It was like nature itself was swallowing it up, trees and underbrush creeping in, narrowing the path until it was just a thin line through the woods. The sunlight had almost completely disappeared now, and I could feel the temperature dropping. I paused for a moment, realizing I hadn't seen any other hikers in hours. I had passed a few people earlier in the day, but now it felt like I was the only one out here. I should have turned back. I knew that. I had always been cautious about hiking alone, but this time, for some reason, I had pushed that caution aside. The wind picked up suddenly, swirling through the trees, and I couldn't help but feel a chill run through me. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and continued on, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. The trail ahead was barely visible now, the fading light making it difficult to see the uneven ground beneath my feet. I stumbled on a root and caught myself on a tree, cursing under my breath. It wasn't much of a fall, but it was enough to remind me how quickly things could go wrong out here. I looked up at the sky, trying to gauge how much daylight I had left. It was hard to tell. The forest canopy above was so thick that only a few scattered rays of light filtered through, casting strange, elongated shadows. I checked my watch. It was well past 6 now. I had been hiking for over 6 hours. I was tired, my legs sore, and I knew I should have turned back hours ago. The decision to keep going felt foolish, but at this point, I felt committed. I had to push through, but I wasn't sure where the trail was leading anymore. It had become harder to follow, the path overgrown with thick vines and brambles. I was barely pushing my way through when I saw it, an old, weathered sign partially obscured by ivy. I walked up to it, brushing the leaves aside to read the words on the sign. Trail end. I had reached the end of the trail, but that didn't make sense. According to the map, the trail should have continued on, looping back toward the main park entrance. This wasn't the end. I had to be missing something. I looked around, trying to orient myself, but there was no sign of any other trail. Just more trees, more thick forest, and nothing that resembled the open trail I had been following earlier. A wave of panic started to build in my chest. I should have paid more attention. I should have turned around sooner, but instead, I had kept going, and now I was stuck, alone in the woods with no clear way back. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. The last thing I needed was to panic. I looked around again, trying to decide which direction to head in. The trees looked the same no matter where I turned. The path I had come from was barely visible anymore, swallowed by the underbrush. I checked the map again, but it didn't help. The trail markers were sparse, and I had no clear indication of where to go next. I decided to backtrack, retracing my steps, but after walking for what felt like miles, I realized something was wrong. The woods had changed. The trees no longer looked familiar. The shadows were deeper, and the air felt colder. It was then that I heard it, a faint rustling in the underbrush behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The rustling continued, but it wasn't the wind this time. It was something else. I didn't know what, but it was too deliberate, too controlled to be an animal. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly turned around. Nothing. The woods were silent again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I started walking faster now, my pace quickening as I kept my eyes scanning the trees around me. The rustling had stopped, but my mind was racing, and every snap of a twig, every shift of the leaves, felt like something was following me. I wasn't sure how much time had passed when I finally reached a clearing, but I wasn't relieved. Instead of a familiar trail, all I saw were tall, thick trees surrounding me. The open space was deceptive, like it was leading me deeper into the woods. I should have stayed on the original path. I should have turned back sooner. I should have trusted my instincts when I first started to feel uneasy, but it was too late now. I tried to keep my breathing steady, telling myself that I wasn't in immediate danger. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how foolish I had been to wander this far out. I should have known better than to ignore that nagging feeling. Now, I had no idea how to get back, and no one was around to help. I took another deep breath and started walking again, determined to get back to the main trail. I focused on the ground, trying to find signs of a path, any sign that I wasn't completely lost. Then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw it. Another trail marker, small but visible, tucked away behind some ferns. I made my way toward it, almost running now, and then I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. A small, abandoned cabin stood at the edge of the clearing. It looked old, run down, and out of place, but there it was. The cabin was clearly not in use, with its broken windows and sagging roof. But it was shelter, and at that point I was desperate for any sign of civilization. I cautiously approached the cabin, checking the windows for any signs of movement. There was nothing, just dust and decay. I pulled the door open slowly, half expecting it to creak loudly, but it didn't. It was quiet, the air inside still and stale. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped in, and I immediately felt the temperature drop even further. Inside, it was bare, save for some old furniture that had been left behind. A cot with a tattered blanket, a chair, and a small wood stove. It was nothing luxurious, but it was a safe place for now. I sat down on the cot, exhausted. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears as I tried to process everything that had happened. The weird feeling in the woods, the sense that I was being followed, the trail that had led me here, it didn't add up. But for the first time since I started this hike, I felt a sense of calm. I had found shelter. I had found safety. And for the first time in hours, I could finally breathe. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat there in the cabin, knowing that I had made it through the hardest part. Tomorrow, I would find my way back to the main trail. But for now, I could rest. And for once, everything felt okay. It was a cool morning when I set out on my hike. I'd been planning this trip for weeks, and I was determined to make the most of it. The weather had been perfect for the past few days, and I was excited to finally get away from everything and just lose myself in the mountains for a few hours. I had been to this part of the trail before, but this time I planned to go farther than I ever had. I left early, just after sunrise, when the light was still soft and everything had that calm, almost magical feel. The air smelled fresh, a mix of pine and earth, and I could hear the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. I strapped on my boots, checked my pack to make sure I had enough water, snacks, and a map, and headed out. The trail was well marked, so I didn't expect to get lost. I had been hiking for about an hour when I started to feel a strange unease creeping up on me. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint right away, just a vague sense of something being off. I chalked it up to nerves, though. I wasn't exactly a seasoned hiker, but I had done enough day hikes to feel confident. The feeling nagged at me a little, but I tried to shake it off. The trail wound through the trees, climbing steadily, but the sun was warm now, and I started to feel more relaxed. The higher I went, the fewer people I saw. It was quiet, except for the occasional chirping of birds or the distant sound of a squirrel darting through the underbrush. The peace was refreshing, and I was grateful for the solitude. It was around 2 hours in when I noticed something unusual. The trail, which had been smooth and easy to follow, started to split. There were no signs marking which way to go, and that made me pause. It wasn't that I was unfamiliar with unmarked trails. I had hiked enough to know that sometimes paths could diverge and reconnect. But this felt different. This split seemed deliberate, as though someone had intentionally created two options. I glanced at my map, but the section I was on wasn't detailed enough to show minor trail splits. I stood there for a moment, unsure of which direction to take. To the left, the path continued up the mountain, climbing steeper. To the right, the trail seemed to descend into a small valley, where I could see a patch of blue, maybe a stream or a pond. The idea of following the stream appealed to me, so I chose the right path, figuring I could always turn around if it didn't lead anywhere interesting. The further I walked down the right path, the more it seemed to narrow. The trees closed in around me, and the air became thicker with the scent of damp soil and moss. It was quieter here too. No birds, no squirrels, just the rustle of leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a twig. I could hear the stream now, just beyond the trees, but the trail didn't seem to lead directly to it. I pushed forward, my curiosity getting the better of me. Eventually, the trail seemed to fade altogether. I could still hear the stream, and I knew I couldn't be far from it. But the path had disappeared. I checked the map again, but there was nothing indicating where I was. My stomach turned slightly, a small warning that I shouldn't have ignored earlier. I stopped, trying to decide whether I should turn back or keep going. My instincts were telling me to leave, but there was something about the quiet and the isolation that made me want to keep exploring. I told myself that I'd just take a few more steps, see if the trail reappeared. I kept walking, pushing through the brush and undergrowth. The sound of the stream grew louder, and I was almost relieved when I finally saw a small clearing. The ground sloped gently down to a rocky bed, with water trickling through. There was a peacefulness to the scene, and I sat on a large rock near the water's edge, taking a deep breath. It wasn't until I was sitting there, taking in the beauty of the place, that I started to notice the oddities around me. The trees, while tall and old, didn't feel quite right. Their trunks were twisted, their branches bent in strange angles, and the ground beneath them was covered in thick, uneven roots. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was something unnerving about the way the trees seemed to lean in towards the clearing, almost as if they were watching me. I stood up, a little uneasy now, and glanced around. There was no other path leading off from the clearing, just the stream and the dense forest beyond. I decided it was time to head back to the main trail. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. At the far side of the clearing, partially hidden by the trees, was something that didn't belong. It looked like a pile of rocks, but they were arranged too deliberately, almost as if someone had built a small structure. I walked toward it, my curiosity piqued once again. The closer I got, the more I realized it wasn't just a pile of rocks. It was a small cairn, stacked neatly with rocks of varying sizes. But there was something wrong about it. The stones were arranged in a way that felt unsettling, too perfect, too intentional. I couldn't explain why, but standing there, staring at that cairn, I felt a deep unease settle in my chest. It felt like I had stumbled onto something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. I stepped back, my heart rate increasing. I had no idea what I was getting into, but I had to get out of there. I turned around and retraced my steps, keeping my eyes focused on the ground in front of me. I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid, but it felt like the woods around me had grown quieter, almost as if they were holding their breath. I made it back to the split in the trail, but now I wasn't sure which way to go. The path I had come from no longer felt like a safe option. I glanced toward the left, the way that led uphill, and something in my gut told me that was the better choice. I took a deep breath and started walking uphill, determined to find my way back to the main trail. The higher I climbed, the more the tension in my body eased. The path here was well marked, and the sounds of the forest returned to their usual chorus. Birds chirped, leaves rustled in the breeze, and the ground was firm underfoot. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong with that clearing. I didn't stop to rest until I reached the summit, and when I did, I took a moment to look out over the valley below. The view was breathtaking. I could see miles of forest stretching out in every direction, and in the distance, I could make out the outline of the main trail I had been aiming for. The sun was high now, and the air was warm. I felt a sense of relief flood through me. But just as I started to relax, I heard something in the distance. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't the wind. It was a noise, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere below. A series of soft thuds, almost like footsteps. I froze. I didn't move a muscle, straining my ears to hear more. It was hard to tell exactly where it was coming from, but it was definitely there, a rhythmic thumping sound that seemed to be getting closer. I glanced around, but there was no sign of anyone. No other hikers, no vehicles, just the vast, empty wilderness. The thuds stopped, and in the silence that followed, I suddenly realized how alone I was. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen anyone on the trail. A chill crept down my spine, but I shook it off, forcing myself to breathe steadily. I started back down the trail, making my way toward the parking lot. The noise had faded, but my heart was still pounding in my chest. I had no idea what I had heard, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. The trail took me back to familiar ground, and when I finally saw my car in the distance, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't until I was safely inside, with the doors locked and the engine running, that I allowed myself to fully exhale. I didn't speak to anyone about what happened on that hike. Not right away. It seemed too strange, too out of place to explain. But the memories of the cairn, the eerie quiet of the clearing, and the footsteps that weren't footsteps stayed with me. There were no answers, no clear explanation. But something told me that whatever had been in those woods didn't want to be found, and I was just lucky to get out. The trail I chose that morning seemed harmless enough, a well-trodden path that twisted through the dense woods, a few miles away from the nearest town. I had been hiking for years, always seeking out the quiet places far from the bustle of civilization, and this trail, despite its reputation for being a bit more rugged, felt familiar to me. I knew the area, had hiked it several times before, but something about today felt different, even though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The weather was perfect. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, casting a golden hue over everything, and the temperature was just right. Not too hot, not too cold. I started out early, hoping to get a good few hours in before I had to turn back, knowing that the sun would set quickly in the mountains. The first few miles passed without incident. The trail was narrow, winding between thick clusters of trees, their branches high above my head, forming a natural canopy. Birds flitted between the branches, their songs filling the air in a pleasant symphony. The ground was soft beneath my boots, a mixture of dirt, pine needles, and the occasional patch of moss that seemed to cushion every step. I paused for a moment to catch my breath and take in the surroundings. It was peaceful, too peaceful in a way. The deeper I went into the woods, the quieter it became. At first, it was the usual forest sounds, rustling leaves, the distant call of a crow, the occasional scurrying of small animals. But as I ventured further, the noises seemed to fade away. The silence wasn't normal. It wasn't the kind of silence I'd experienced before when hiking, where the forest was still but alive with the hum of nature. This felt different, as if the world had stopped turning for just a moment. I shook off the unease that crept up my spine. I was overthinking things. It was just a quiet stretch of the trail, nothing more. I pulled the straps of my backpack tighter, took a swig from my water bottle, and kept moving forward. By the time I reached the halfway point, I started to feel it, the slight tension in the air that I couldn't explain. The trees here were older, their trunks thick and twisted, their branches gnarled and reaching like skeletal hands. The underbrush was dense, almost impenetrable in some places, with thick vines and thorny bushes trying to choke out any open space. That's when I heard it, a sound, far off in the distance, muffled by the thickness of the trees. It was the unmistakable crack of a branch snapping under the weight of something large. My heart skipped a beat, and I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen. Another crack, then a rustle. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. It was probably a deer or some other animal, I told myself. The woods were full of them. I had heard that sound countless times before. I was just overthinking it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. I resumed walking, trying to push the thought to the back of my mind. But the sounds of the forest, once comforting, now seemed more ominous. Each step felt heavier than the last, the stillness around me pressing in from all sides. The further I went, the more the trail seemed to change. The path had started out clear and distinct, but now it was overgrown in places, the edges obscured by wild ferns and tangled vines. My boots crunched through the underbrush, and the trail narrowed as it wound its way up the side of a steep hill. The ground was uneven, the earth loose in some spots, causing me to slip a few times. I paused again, wiping the sweat from my forehead, looking around for a place to rest. There was a small clearing up ahead, just beyond a thick thicket of brush. It seemed like a good spot to take a break, so I made my way toward it, grateful for any patch of open ground. As I approached the clearing, I noticed something strange. There was no sign of animal tracks, no rustling bushes, no distant calls, just a quiet emptiness. I stepped into the clearing, but something made me hesitate. There was a small wooden marker on the ground, half hidden by the grass. I bent down to inspect it, my curiosity piqued. It was a trail marker, but not one I recognized. It was old, weathered, and worn, its paint chipped and faded. The letters were barely legible, but I could make out something like Raven's Ridge. I frowned. I had never seen this marker before, and I certainly didn't recall any trail by that name. I stood up, feeling an odd unease settle in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't unusual to see markers for different routes, but this one felt off, like it was out of place. I took a few steps further into the clearing, my mind racing. It didn't help that the stillness had returned, even more pronounced than before. It was as though the forest had swallowed up every sound, leaving me completely alone in the vast silence. The sunlight seemed dimmer here too, as if something was blocking it. I looked up, but the canopy above me was still open, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. That's when I heard it again, the snap of a branch, this time much closer. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained my ears, trying to make out the source of the sound, but there was nothing. No movement, no rustling leaves, just silence. I took another step, then another, my eyes scanning the edges of the clearing, but I saw nothing. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, and I could no longer ignore it. I didn't know how long I stood there, but eventually, I decided to leave. The calm I had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of discomfort. I turned around and made my way back to the trail, trying to steady my breathing, but the weight of the silence pressed in on me, and my pace quickened. As I made my way down the hill, I noticed something strange. There were no other tracks on the trail, no signs of animals, no prints in the dirt, no disturbed leaves. The trail was as pristine as it had been when I first set foot on it that morning. It was wrong. It didn't make sense. I pushed myself harder, my feet moving faster now as the unease turned to outright fear. It was ridiculous, I knew, but the thought that someone was out there, following me, wouldn't leave my mind. The sounds of the forest that had once been comforting now felt alien and dangerous. Every crack of a branch, every gust of wind, Every flutter of leaves felt like a warning. My breath was coming in short gasps by the time I reached the place where the trail split. I had a choice. I could go left, back toward the way I had come, or I could take the right-hand fork, which I knew would lead me back to the main trailhead. I didn't hesitate. I took the right fork, moving as fast as I could. The path was steeper now, winding around large rocks and boulders, but I barely noticed. My mind was focused solely on getting out of the woods, getting back to safety. But the deeper I went, the more the trail seemed to twist. The landscape that had once seemed familiar now felt like a maze. The trees, the rocks, even the sky above seemed wrong. I had been here before, I knew I had, but it no longer felt like the same place. The trail was changing, shifting with every step I took. I tried to steady myself, but panic had set in. I began to run, my legs aching with the effort, my mind clouded with fear. The sky overhead had darkened, the sun dipping below the horizon as the trees closed in around me. The trail seemed endless, winding through the woods with no sign of the clearing I had passed earlier. And then I saw it. Up ahead, barely visible through the trees, was the unmistakable shape of a cabin, small, dilapidated, and half hidden by the overgrowth. I didn't know how I had missed it before, but there it was, standing just off the trail. I froze, my heart pounding, terror washing over me. The cabin wasn't part of any trail I knew. It wasn't even on the map. I took a hesitant step forward, my feet moving on their own. Something about the cabin felt familiar, like I had seen it before, even though I knew I hadn't. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but my legs carried me closer. When I reached the door, I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me again. I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The feeling of being watched, the eerie silence, the fear that had been building in my chest, all of it disappeared. I stood there, breathing hard, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the answer didn't come. There was no one there. The woods were quiet again, as if nothing had ever happened. And with that, I turned and walked back down the trail, my heart still racing, but no longer with the terror that had gripped me before. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the parking lot, the sun had set completely, and the woods were bathed in moonlight. Everything seemed calm once more, and I wondered if it had all been a product of my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me in the solitude of the forest. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. The woods had been quiet again by the time I left, and that felt like enough. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't. It started out as a routine trip. I've been hiking for years, usually alone. There's something about being out there, away from everything, that clears my mind. It helps me think, or not think, depending on the day. That's why I love it. I'd planned to spend the weekend on the trail, just a few miles out from the nearest town, and it seemed like the perfect time to get away. The trail I chose was relatively easy, at least by my standards. It was a well-marked path, a little steep in places, but nothing I couldn't handle. The weather was ideal, cool and crisp in the morning with a slight breeze that didn't bite. The sun was just starting to rise as I left the parking area, casting a soft orange glow over everything. Birds were chirping, and the air smelled fresh, like pine and damp earth. The first few hours were peaceful, with nothing but the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. I'd done this many times before, hiking through forests, climbing hills, finding quiet spots to rest. I had a routine. I'd stop at a creek or a clearing every so often to hydrate, stretch my legs, and enjoy the silence. But something felt different today. There was an unease in the air, subtle but present. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe it was because I hadn't hiked alone in a while. Regardless, I pushed it out of my mind and kept going. The trail eventually began to narrow, winding through a dense thicket of trees. The shadows deepened as the sunlight struggled to break through the thick canopy above. It wasn't particularly cold yet, but the air had a certain heaviness to it, as if something was weighing it down. The path grew more uneven, with rocks scattered here and there, forcing me to step carefully. I didn't mind, though. I'd always enjoyed the challenge of more rugged terrain. I was about 4 hours into the hike when I came across a small, old bridge, the kind you'd expect to find in a fairy tale, with rotting wooden planks and a shallow stream running beneath it. It was a good spot to take a break, so I sat down on one of the rocks nearby, pulled out my water bottle, and took a long drink. The sound of the water running over rocks was soothing, and for a moment, I felt at peace again. The unease I'd felt earlier seemed to fade. I was alone in the forest, but I was used to it. I checked my map, confirming that I was still on the right path. According to the trail markers, I was getting close to my destination, a small clearing that was supposed to offer a breathtaking view of the valley below. It was a spot I'd been to before, and I looked forward to it, as I always did. But as I stood up to continue, I noticed something odd. There were fresh footprints in the mud near the bridge. First, I didn't think much of it. It wasn't unusual to see tracks from other hikers, especially in a well-known area like this. But these weren't like the usual boot prints I was used to seeing. They were deeper, more pronounced, like someone had been walking through the mud recently. There was also a strange, jagged quality to the prints, as if they were made by boots that didn't fit quite right. I frowned and looked around. I didn't see anyone. The forest was eerily quiet, and the normal sounds of wildlife seemed to be missing. I told myself it was nothing, just another hiker who had passed through. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I was starting to feel like I wasn't alone anymore, but I pushed the thought aside. I needed to keep moving. I crossed the bridge and continued on the trail, but the unease began to return. The farther I went, the more I noticed things out of place. Twigs snapped in the distance, though I couldn't see anyone. Every now and then, I thought I heard the faintest rustling behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. It was unsettling, to say the least. By the time I reached the clearing, it was nearly midday. The sun was high in the sky, but the forest was still dark and quiet. The view was just as beautiful as I remembered, but I couldn't fully enjoy it. I kept glancing over my shoulder, as if expecting someone to be standing behind me. I knew it was probably just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I sat down on a large boulder near the edge of the clearing, trying to calm myself. I took another drink of water and forced myself to focus on the view. The valley stretched out below me, with distant mountains in the background and a river winding through the trees. It was peaceful, tranquil even, but I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a rustling, soft at first, but growing louder. My heart skipped a beat. I turned around quickly, expecting to see a deer or perhaps a person coming through the trees. But there was nothing, just the same quiet forest. I stood up, my pulse racing, and looked around. I checked the trail behind me, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no movement, just the wind blowing through the trees. But then, just as I was about to sit back down, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A large rock had been moved just off the path. It was nothing unusual, really. Rocks roll and shift all the time. But this one was placed deliberately, positioned in a way that seemed intentional. It was large, almost as if someone had set it there to block the path. My first instinct was to leave, but I told myself to stay calm. It was probably nothing. Maybe someone had been using the rock to rest or mark the trail. But deep down, I knew that it didn't feel right. I decided to keep moving, hoping that the feeling of being watched would go away. But as I started to leave the clearing and re-enter the forest, something caught my eye, a flash of movement to my right. I froze. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it, but then it happened again. Someone or something darting between the trees, too quick for me to catch a full glimpse. My heart began to race, and I instinctively stepped back, reaching for my pack. I didn't know what was happening, but I had a bad feeling about it. I turned to leave the clearing and head back to the trailhead, but my mind was racing. I kept thinking about those footprints, the feeling of being watched, and the rock that had been moved. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Someone was out here with me. I started walking faster, my eyes scanning the trees, my senses on high alert. The trail didn't seem as welcoming anymore. The shadows seemed to grow deeper, and the wind began to pick up, rustling the leaves with a strange intensity. It was as if the forest itself had changed, shifting in ways I couldn't understand. The next few hours felt like a blur. I kept moving, trying to get back to the trailhead, but the path seemed unfamiliar, like I had missed a turn or somehow wandered off track. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made my heart race. I didn't dare look over my shoulder, but I could feel that presence behind me. It was getting closer. By the time I finally saw the familiar shape of the parking lot through the trees, I felt a wave of relief. My legs were sore, my mind exhausted, and my senses were stretched thin. I picked up the pace, eager to get back to safety. But as I reached the edge of the forest, I heard one final sound, a slow, deliberate step on the ground behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I sprinted the last few hundred feet to my car, got in, and locked the doors, my breath ragged and heavy. I didn't look back as I started the engine and drove off, away from the forest. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been following me the entire time. I never went back to that trail.